The biggest lie about slavery in history. Close your eyes for a moment. When you hear the word slave, what do you see? Chains, whips, half-starved bodies dragging stones under the burning sun. Men collapsing, guards screaming, total misery, total powerlessness. That image is so strong, so emotional, that most people never question it. But what if I told you that this image has very little to do with the daily reality of most workers in ancient Egypt? And what if I told you something even more disturbing? What if I told you that millions, possibly billions, of people alive today live worse lives than many of the so-called slaves of ancient Egypt? That sentence alone probably makes you uncomfortable. Good. It should. Because this video is not here to make you feel safe. It's here to make you think. The problem with how we talk about slavery. Modern people love simple stories. Good guys, bad guys, victims, villains, and history, unfortunately, gets flattened into emotional cliches. Ancient Egypt becomes a cartoon. Evil pharaohs, endless cruelty, mass slavery, no rights, no dignity. But real history is rarely that simple. The word slave itself is the first problem. We use one word to describe very different systems across thousands of years. Roman chattel slavery, Atlantic slave trade, medieval serfdom, debt bondage, prison labor, state workers, and then we project the worst version of slavery onto every civilization that came before us. Ancient Egypt is one of the biggest victims of this misunderstanding. Who built the pyramids, and why this question matters? Let's start with the most famous myth. You've heard it 1,000 times. The pyramids were built by slaves. It sounds logical. Huge structures, primitive tools, thousands of workers. But modern archaeology tells a very different story. Excavations near the Giza Plateau uncovered permanent worker villages, organized housing, bakeries, breweries, medical facilities, cemeteries where workers were buried with honor. Slaves don't get honorable burials next to kings. These workers were not disposable objects. They were state laborers. And this distinction changes everything. Labor in ancient Egypt was a duty, not a sentence. Ancient Egypt functioned on a system that feels strange to us today. There was no modern money economy like ours. No banks. No monthly salaries wired to accounts. Instead, Egypt ran on grain, land, labor obligations. Most people owed labor time to the state, not money. Think of it like this. If you were a farmer, you worked your land most of the year. But during flood seasons, when farming paused, you worked for the state. Construction, canals, temples, roads. In return, the state guaranteed food, housing, protection, medical care, religious inclusion. This was not freedom as we define it today. But it was not mindless cruelty either. So were there actual SLAVs? Yes, absolutely. But they were not the majority of the workforce. Slaves in ancient Egypt usually came from war captives, criminal punishment, debt bondage. Even then, slavery in Egypt was not permanent by default. Slaves could own property, marry free people, buy their freedom, be freed by their masters, rise into skilled professions. That alone should already break your mental image. A system where slaves can earn wages, have families, gain freedom, is fundamentally different from what most people imagine. The modern arrogance problem. Here, where things get uncomfortable. Modern humans assume we are more advanced, therefore more humane. But that assumption is rarely tested. Let me ask you something. If a person today works 10-12 hours a day, has no job security, lives paycheck to paycheck, cannot afford health care, is buried in debt, is one accident away from homelessness, how free are they really? They may not wear chains, but chains don't always need iron. Why this video is going to annoy people. This video challenges a comforting belief. Things are bad now, but at least we're not slaves. That belief protects us from asking harder questions. Questions like, why do so many people work more than medieval laborers? Why do millions lack food security in a world of abundance? Why does freedom feel so fragile? Ancient Egyptians didn't have smartphones. They didn't have democracy. They didn't have modern medicine. But many of them had something modern people lack. Certainty. Certainty that they would eat tomorrow. Their children would survive. They would have shelter. They belonged to a social order that would not discard them overnight. Comfort vs. freedom. Modern life offers comfort, entertainment, technology, convenience. Ancient life offered stability, guaranteed rations, fixed social roles, communal identity. Which one is better? That depends on where you stand. For the elite, modern life is heaven. For the bottom billions, it's not so clear. This is why comparing ancient Egyptian laborers to modern white-collar and blue-collar workers is not insanity. It's necessary. A warning to the viewer. Before we go any further, you need to understand something. This video is not romanticizing slavery. It is not denying suffering. It is not saying ancient Egypt was a utopia. It is doing something far more dangerous. It is questioning our definition of progress. Because progress is not a straight line. And history does not move in one direction. Sometimes we gain things. Sometimes we lose things. And sometimes we trade visible chains for invisible ones. What we will do in this series. In the next parts, we will break this down carefully. How Egyptian labor actually worked day to day. What wages meant in a grain-based economy. What slaves and workers could buy with those wages. Their diets, housing, medical care. Their family lives and social status. Then we will compare all of this to modern blue-collar workers, modern white-collar workers. Not emotionally, not ideologically, but structurally. And finally, we will ask the question most people are afraid of. Are most humans today truly living better lives than ancient laborers? Or do we just have better distractions? Ending hook, very important. So before you comment, before you get angry, before you decide this video is wrong, ask yourself one thing. If an ancient Egyptian worker was guaranteed food, shelter, healthcare, community, and rest, and a modern worker is guaranteed nothing except the right to keep working, who is really closer to freedom? In the next part, we go deep into the daily life of Egyptian workers and slaves, hour by hour, meal by meal. And that's where the comparison starts to get truly uncomfortable. Who was a slave in ancient Egypt? Before we can compare ancient Egypt to the modern world, we must fix one fundamental mistake. We use the word slave as if it meant the same thing everywhere. In every era, under every system. It does not. In ancient Egypt, the word slave did not describe a single uniform group. It described several very different realities. And confusing those realities is how history gets distorted. Different types of workers in ancient Egypt. Ancient Egyptian society was built on layers, not binaries. People were not simply free or enslaved. There was a spectrum of labor status. Let's break it down clearly. 1. State laborers. The largest workforce in ancient Egypt was made up of state laborers. These were not slaves in the modern sense. They were farmers during agricultural seasons, construction workers during flood seasons, canal diggers, road builders, temple workers. They worked because it was their obligation to the state, not because they were owned as property. In return, the state provided food rations, housing or housing support, protection, medical care, religious inclusion. This was closer to mandatory public service than to chattel slavery. 2. Skilled artisans and craftsmen. Then there were skilled workers, stone cutters, carpenters, metal workers, painters, scribes. These people were highly valued. They were paid better rations, given better housing, and often lived in organized worker villages. Some of them were technically unfree, but their living conditions were far superior. To many free peasants, skill mattered more than status. 3. Private household servants. This group looks closer to what we imagine as slavery. Household servants worked for noble families, priests, military elites. They cooked, cleaned, raised children, managed estates. Some were free wage workers. Some were debt-bound. Some were war captives. Their lives depended heavily on the household they served. A kind master meant a stable life. A cruel master meant suffering. This was inequality, but still not identical to modern racialized slavery systems. 4. True slaves. Yes, true slaves existed, but they were not the backbone of the economy. Most slaves came from war captives, criminal punishment, debt bonded. They were the smallest group, not the majority. And even then, Egyptian slavery had limits. Who really built the pyramids? Now we address the most famous myth. The pyramids. Popular culture tells us slaves dragged stones. They were beaten. They died in mass numbers. Archaeology tells us something else. Near Giza, researchers found worker villages with planned streets, bakeries producing thousands of loaves per day, breweries producing large quantities of beer, medical tools and healed skeletons, cemeteries where workers were buried with care. These were state laborers, not slaves. They worked in rotating crews. They received rations. They had rest days. They had medical treatment. Slaves do not receive health care, organized burials, honorary graves near royal monuments. The pyramid builders were workers, not owned property. Forced labor vs. contracted labor. This is where nuance matters. Ancient Egypt used both forced labor and contracted labor. Forced labor existed as punishment for crimes, as a result of war captivity. These people had fewer rights. They were closely supervised. They performed the hardest tasks. Contracted labor also existed. Seasonal workers, skilled artisans, state-assigned laborers. They were not free to refuse, but they were not owned. This is closer to mandatory military service, state-assigned labor programs, not to plantation slavery. Legal status of slaves in ancient Egypt. Here is where ancient Egypt becomes deeply uncomfortable for modern assumptions. Slaves were recognized as legal persons. They could own property, marry free individuals, have legally recognized children, testify in court, earn wages or rations, buy their freedom. This does not mean they lived easy lives. It means they were not erased as humans. Compare this to system where slaves were legally considered objects. Egypt did not go that far. Could slaves change owners? Yes, but not in the way modern people imagine. Slaves could be sold, gifted, inherited. However, excessive cruelty could result in punishment. Slaves could flee to temples and seek protection. Religious institutions sometimes intervened. Temples were powerful institutions. They acted as moral authorities. This created limits on abuse, even if imperfect. The punishment system. Ancient Egypt was not gentle. Punishments existed. Beatings, forced labor, exile, death for severe crimes. Slaves received harsher punishment than free citizens. That is undeniable. But here is the key difference. Punishment was regulated. It was not random violence. There were laws. There were procedures. There were records. That alone separates Egypt from chaos-based slavery systems. The economic logic behind Egyptian slavery. Egypt did not rely on slavery because it didn't need to. Why? Because the Nile guaranteed food. Seasonal floods paused farming. Massive labor was available voluntarily or by obligation. When labor is abundant, slavery becomes less economically necessary. This is why slavery never fully dominated Egypt the way it did Rome. Why modern people misunderstand this. Modern people project their own trauma backward. We imagine capitalism, wage dependency, rent, debt. Ancient Egypt did not function like this. People were tied to land, community, and state, not to markets. Security mattered more than freedom. Stability mattered more than mobility. A hard question. If a person is not free to quit their job, but guaranteed food, shelter, and care, are they more enslaved than someone who is free to quit, but risks starvation, homelessness, and medical ruin? This is not an easy question, and ancient Egypt forces us to face it. Transition to next part. Now that we understand who slaves were and who they were not, we can finally talk about daily life. Not myths, not movies, not emotions. Real routines, real meals, real workdays. In the next part, we will walk through a single day in the life of an ancient Egyptian worker and slave. Hour by hour, meal by meal, body by body. And that is where the comparison with modern workers becomes impossible to ignore. Daily life of slaves and workers in ancient Egypt. To understand whether ancient Egyptian slaves lived better or worse than modern workers, we must leave theory behind. We must enter daily life. Not myths, not symbols, not statues, but mornings, meals, work hours, pain, rest, sleep. Because freedom in practice is lived hour by hour. A typical morning in ancient Egypt. The day did not begin with an alarm clock. It began with the sun. Most workers woke up at dawn, not because they were forced, but because daylight controlled everything. There was no artificial lighting, no night shifts, no 24-hour economy. Darkness meant rest. The first activity of the day was simple: washing at the river or water basin, a short prayer or offering, a basic morning meal. No rushing, no traffic, no notifications. Time moved slower. Breakfast, simple but reliable. Breakfast was not luxurious, but it was consistent. A typical morning meal included bread made from emmer wheat, beer with low alcohol content, occasionally onions or dates. Beer was not a luxury drink. It was safer than water. It contained calories. It provided nutrients. Workers did not skip meals. Rations were planned. Food distribution was organized. Hunger existed, but starvation was not normal for state workers. Work hours less than you think. This is where modern assumptions start to collapse. Workdays were long but not endless. Most labor followed daylight. Sunrise to late afternoon. Breaks during extreme heat. Reduced hours during festivals. There were rest periods. There were religious holidays. There were seasonal pauses. During Nile flood seasons, agricultural work stopped. That is when construction work increased. But even then, crews rotated. Workers rested. Injuries were treated. This was not a non-stop grind. Types of daily work. Not all work was equal. Unskilled labor. Carrying stones. Digging canals. Transporting materials. Physically demanding. Exhausting. Risky. Skilled labor. Stone carving. Painting. Writing. Planning. These workers worked fewer hours. They were protected. They were respected. Skill reduced suffering. Just like today. What about slaves specifically? Slaves worked longer hours than free workers. That is true. But even slaves were not worked to constant collapse. Why? Because replacing a slave was expensive. A dead worker was a wasted investment. Cruelty existed. But systematic self-destruction did not make sense. Slaves were fed enough to work, rested enough to survive, treated enough to continue. This is not kindness. It is economic logic. Lunch and midday rest. Midday heat in Egypt was dangerous. Work slowed down. This was not optional. Heat exhaustion kills productivity. Workers rested in shade. They ate small meals. They drank beer or water. This break mattered. Compare that to modern workers. Fluorescent lights. No daylight awareness. No seasonal rhythm. The ancient workday followed nature. The modern one fights it. Medical care, the shocking part. This surprises many people. Ancient Egyptian workers had access to medical care. Evidence shows bone fractures healed properly. Amputations survived. Dental treatments performed. Medical papyri detailing treatments. Doctors existed. Medical knowledge existed. Were they perfect? No. But treatment existed. A modern uninsured worker with a broken bone may receive nothing. This comparison is uncomfortable. Injuries and compensation. Work was dangerous. People got hurt. But injured workers were removed from labor, given food rations, allowed time to heal. Skeletons show healed injuries that required weeks or months of rest. You cannot heal while being beaten daily. This proves something important. Workers were allowed to recover. Housing conditions. Workers did not sleep in chains. They lived in small mud brick houses, shared living spaces, organized worker villages. Privacy was limited. Comfort was basic. But housing was guaranteed. Close to work. Communal. No rent. No eviction. Homelessness did not exist in the modern sense. Family life after work. This is where ancient Egypt differs radically from many slave systems. After work, people went home. They had spouses, children, community. Slaves could marry. Workers had families. Children were raised within stable communities. The family unit mattered. There was no idea of working until midnight. While children slept alone, work ended. Life began. EVNGS and social life. Evenings were simple. People ate together, talked, sang, played games, participated in rituals. Entertainment was communal. There was no isolation. Loneliness existed, but mass social isolation did not. Religion as psychological support. Religion was not separate from life. It explained suffering. It promised meaning. It structured time. Festivals mattered. Workers received days off, extra rations, celebrations. Modern workers often lose holidays. Ancient workers gained them. Sleep and recovery. When the sun went down, activity slowed. Sleep came early. There was no second shift. No side hustle. No gig economy. The body recovered. This alone changes everything. What daily life really felt like. Was life easy? No. Was it brutal? Sometimes. But it was predictable, structured, supported. Modern life is flexible, unstable, individualized. Ancient suffering was physical. Modern suffering is psychological. Both are real. A critical comparison point. If a modern worker works longer hours, sleeps less, eats worse, fears unemployment, lacks health care, can we honestly say they live better? Technology improves comfort. It does not guarantee dignity. Ancient Egypt understood dignity differently. Transition to next part. Now we understand daily life. Not the extremes. Not propaganda. The average. In the next part, we tackle the most controversial issue of all. Money. Did ancient Egyptian workers and slaves receive wages? What did those wages really buy? And how do they compare to modern salaries? That comparison will shock more people than anything so far. WAGES, rations, and economic power in ancient Egypt. When modern people hear the word wage, they imagine money, coins, banknotes, numbers in an app. Ancient Egypt did not work like that. But that does not mean workers were unpaid. It means payment followed a different logic. And once you understand that logic, the comparison with modern salaries becomes deeply uncomfortable. What did payment mean in ancient Egypt? Egypt operated on a ration-based economy. The state did not ask, how much money should we give this worker? It asked, what does this worker need to survive, work, and remain stable? Payment was calculated in grain, beer, oil, occasionally meat, occasionally cloth. This was not symbolic. It was practical. Grain as salary. Grain was the backbone of everything. Bread was food. Grain was currency. Grain was power. A standard worker ration could include several kilograms of grain per month, enough to feed the worker, enough to feed a family. Higher skilled workers received more. Supervisors received more. Scribes received significantly more. This was not equality. It was hierarchy. But it was predictable. Beer was part of the way. This always shocks modern audiences. Beer was not entertainment. It was nutrition. Low-alcohol beer provided calories, carbohydrates, safer hydration. Workers received beer daily. Not as a bonus, as a necessity. A worker who could not drink was a worker who could not work. How much was a worker actually paid? Let's make this concrete. Records from Deir el-Medina, a worker village, show detailed ration lists. A typical skilled worker might receive enough grain for multiple loaves per day, daily beer rations, monthly oil rations, periodic meat distributions. This was enough to feed themselves, feed dependents, trade surplus. Yes, trade. Workers could exchange excess rations for goods and services. This means rations were not just survival tools. They were economic power. Could workers save or accumulate wealth? To a degree, yes. Workers could store grain, trade surplus, acquire personal property, own tools, own animals. Some workers became relatively wealthy. Not elite, but secure. Security matters more than luxury. What about slaves? Did they receive wages? Here is the uncomfortable truth. Many slaves received rations comparable to free workers. Not equal, but sufficient. Why? Because an underfed slave is a useless slave. Rations were not kindness. They were maintenance. But maintenance still meant regular food, shelter, basic care. Some slaves even earned additional rations for skilled or dangerous work. What could a worker do with their salary? Let's translate ancient wages into real-life outcomes. With their rations, workers could feed a family, maintain housing, participate in religious festivals, support children, survive illness without immediate ruin. There was no rent market, no interest-bearing debt system. Your salary did not evaporate into landlords and banks. It turned directly into survival. Compare this to a modern salary. Now pause. A modern worker may earn money. But what happens to it? Rent, utilities, transportation, debt, healthcare, insurance. The modern salary leaks constantly. Ancient rations did not leak. They were consumed. This difference is enormous. What about poverty in ancient Egypt? Poverty existed, but it looked different. You were poor if you lacked land, you lacked family support, you lost state protection. But mass starvation among state workers was rare. The Nile stabilized food supply. Modern systems deliberately accept food insecurity. Ancient Egypt did not. Were there strikes? Yes. This is one of the most important details. The first recorded labor strike in history comes from ancient Egypt. Workers at Deir el-Medina went on strike because their rations were delayed. They did not revolt violently. They protested. They demanded payment. And the state responded. Think about that. Slaves do not strike. Workers do. What happened when payments failed? When rations stopped, chaos followed. Workers complained. Work stopped. Authority weakened. This tells us something crucial. The system depended on keeping workers fed. not expendable, essential. Economic freedom vs. economic security. Ancient workers lacked freedom to choose jobs. Modern workers lack freedom to stop working. Which is worse? Ancient workers had fixed roles, but stable survival. Modern workers have theoretical mobility, but constant precarity. Freedom without security is fragile. Security without freedom is rigid. Ancient Egypt chose rigidity. Modern capitalism chooses fragility. What about upward mobility? Upward mobility existed, but slowly. A worker's child could become a scribe, a priest, a skilled artisan. Education mattered, but access was limited. Modern systems promise mobility. Ancient systems delivered stability. Promises and reality are not the same thing. Economic stress then vs. now. Ancient stress came from physical exhaustion, injury, natural disasters. Modern stress comes from debt, time pressure, job insecurity, psychological overload. Ancient stress was visible. Modern stress is invisible. Both destroy lives. A disturbing calculation. Ask yourself this. If a person today works full-time, cannot afford housing, skips meals, avoids doctors, lives paycheck to paycheck, are they truly wealthier than an ancient worker with guaranteed rations? GDP does not answer this. Reality does. Why this matters for the final comparison. We are not saying ancient Egypt was better. We are saying it solved different problems. Modern society solves comfort. Ancient society solved survival. And survival is the foundation of dignity. Transition to next part. Now we understand wages. Not money. Not numbers. Power. In the next part, we move beyond economics. We examine family life, social status, and human dignity. Who could marry? Who could have children? Who belonged? Because a full life is more than food and work. Family, social life, and human dignity in ancient Egypt. When people imagine slavery, they imagine isolation, loneliness, broken families, children taken away, lives reduced to labor. That image is not wrong for many systems in history. But ancient Egypt does not fit neatly into that picture. Because in Egypt, even unfree people were still social beings. And social life changes everything. Family was not a privilege. In many slave systems, family life is a privilege. In ancient Egypt, family life was normal. Workers married. Slaves married. Children were born and raised in households. Marriage did not require elite permission. It required community recognition. This alone separates Egypt from later slave systems. Could slaves marry free people? Yes. And this is one of the most misunderstood facts. Slaves could marry other slaves, free workers, skilled artisans. Marriage did not automatically change legal status, but it created social protection. A slave married into a free household was harder to abuse. Social ties mattered. Children and status. Children usually inherited the status of the mother. This meant a child born to a free woman was free. A child born to a slave woman might be enslaved. But even enslaved children were not treated as disposable. They were raised. They were fed. They were trained. Child labor existed. But child abandonment was rare. Children were economic assets, and emotional ones. The household as a social unit. Life revolved around the household, not the individual. Houses were small. Privacy was limited. Community was unavoidable. Families worked together. A husband might labor for the state. A wife might bake, weave, or trade. Children helped early. This created interdependence. Modern life isolates. Ancient life clustered. Women in ancient Egypt. This is critical. Women in ancient Egypt had rights that shocked later civilizations. Women could own property, inherit wealth, initiate divorce, work, sign contracts. This applied to free women and, in some cases, enslaved women. Family life was not purely patriarchal. Power was shared more than people expect. Love, affection, and emotion. This may surprise you. Ancient Egyptians wrote love poems. They carved family scenes on tombs. They mourned deeply. They celebrated births. These were not emotionless labor units. They were people. Slavery did not erase humanity. It constrained it. Social life after work. Work ended. Life continued. Evenings were communal. People gathered in courtyards, shared meals, told stories, sang songs, played simple games. There was no endless productivity cycle. Work did not invade every hour. Modern workers often live at work. Ancient workers worked, then lived. Festivals and public holidays. Ancient Egypt had many festivals, more than most modern nations. Festivals meant time off, extra food, music, dancing, religious rituals. Workers were not excluded. Slaves were not excluded. Celebration was collective. Religion as social glue. Religion was not just belief. It was structure. It gave meaning to suffering, explanation for hierarchy, hope beyond death. Even the lowest worker believed. Their soul mattered. The afterlife was not elite only. That belief has power. Community protection. Abuse did not go unnoticed. Communities watched each other. Temples acted as sanctuaries. Officials recorded complaints. Neighbors intervened. This did not eliminate cruelty, but it limited it. Social visibility protects people. Modern life hides suffering. Dignity without freedom. This is the core paradox. Ancient Egyptians lacked modern freedom. They could not choose careers freely, travel easily, reject authority, but many retained dignity. They had identity, belonging, predictability. Modern people have freedom, but many lack stability, community, meaning. Which loss hurts more? A modern comparison. Imagine two lives. Life 1. Fixed role, guaranteed food, stable family, limited choice. Life 2. Endless choice, no guarantees, economic anxiety, social isolation. Which one produces less suffering? There is no easy answer. Why family life matters in this comparison. Economic comparisons miss something. Humans do not live on wages alone. They live on relationships, belonging, purpose. Ancient Egypt optimized belonging. Modern society optimizes efficiency. Efficiency does not care about loneliness. Did slaves have names? Yes. And names mattered. Slaves were recorded by name. They were remembered in records. They were buried with inscriptions. They were not numbers. Dehumanization was incomplete. That matters. Death and memory. When people died, they were mourned. Families buried them. Communities remembered them. Even workers had tombs. Even slaves had markers. Death did not erase identity. Modern workers often die invisible. A disturbing realization. If dignity comes from being seen, being fed, being remembered, then many ancient workers had more dignity than modern workers trapped in anonymity. This is not romanticism. It is observation. Transition to next part. We have now examined labor, wages, family, social life. Now comes the hardest comparison of all. We will place ancient Egyptian workers next to modern blue-collar workers, hour by hour, stress by stress, security by security. And many people will not like the result. Ancient slaves, these modern blue-collar workers. Now the comparison becomes personal, because blue-collar workers are not an abstract idea. They are builders, drivers, factory workers, cleaners, warehouse staff, construction crews. They build the modern world with their bodies. So let's place two lives side by side. Not emotionally, not ideologically, structurally, defining the two groups. First, clarity. When we say ancient Egyptian slaves, we mean unfree laborers working under state or private authority, with guaranteed rations, housing, and supervision. When we say modern blue-collar workers, we mean wage laborers selling physical labor in a market economy, often without long-term security. Both use their bodies to survive. That is the common ground. Work HOURS, then V's now. Ancient Egyptian, labor followed the sun. Work started at dawn. Work slowed during extreme heat. Work ended before night. There were seasonal pauses, religious holidays, rotating crews. Now look at modern blue-collar work. Shifts are fixed. Artificial lighting removes natural limits. Night shifts exist. Overtime exists. Productivity never sleeps. The ancient body rested because it had to. The modern body is pushed because it can be. Physical strain. Ancient work was brutal. Stone lifting, digging, transport. Injuries were common, but the pace was human. Modern blue-collar work looks safer. Machines exist. Tools exist. But repetition exists. The same motion. Thousands of times. Every day. The ancient body broke suddenly. The modern body breaks slowly. Rest and recovery. Ancient workers rested because nature demanded it. Heat forced breaks. Darkness forced sleep. Festivals forced rest. Modern workers rest only if allowed. Breaks are scheduled. Sleep is negotiated. Time off is requested. Rest is permission-based. That is a critical difference. Food security. Ancient Egyptian workers were fed. Not well, but reliably. Rations were guaranteed. Delayed rations caused strikes. Food was a right of labor. Modern blue-collar workers must buy food. If wages fail, meals are skipped. Nutrition declines. Hunger appears. In a world of abundance, food is no longer guaranteed. It is conditional. Housing security. Ancient workers had housing. Simple, crowded, but stable. There was no rent market. No eviction system. Modern blue-collar workers rent. Mispayments. Eviction follows. Homelessness becomes possible. Housing is no longer shelter. It is a commodity. Healthcare access. Ancient Egyptian workers received treatment. Basic, primitive, but present. Injured workers were fed while healing. Modern blue-collar workers depend on systems. Insurance, employer coverage, personal savings. An injury can mean debt, job loss, long-term poverty. The ancient system feared losing labor. The modern system replaces it. Job security. Ancient labor was rigid but stable. You had a role. You kept it. You aged within it. Modern blue-collar labor is flexible but unstable. Contracts end. Companies relocate. Automation replaces. Flexibility benefits employers. Stability benefits workers. Ancient Egypt chose stability. Psychological pressure. Ancient stress was physical. Pain, fatigue, injury. Modern stress is mental. Deadlines, surveillance, performance metrics, fear of unemployment. Ancient workers feared gods. Modern workers fear spreadsheets. Which fear lasts longer? Dignity AT work. Ancient workers were visible. Their labor was public. Their contribution was recognized. They built monuments. They served gods. Modern blue-collar workers are invisible. Their labor is hidden behind supply chains. Visibility creates dignity. Invisibility erodes it. Community vs. isolation. Ancient labor was communal. People worked together, lived together, rested together. Modern blue-collar workers often commute alone, work shifts alone, live fragmented lives. Community dissolves. Isolation grows. Strikes and resistance. Ancient workers struck. They protested delayed rations. They were heard. Modern blue-collar workers strike too, but often face job loss, legal pressure, replacement. The risk is higher. Power has shifted. Upward mobility. Ancient mobility was limited, but predictable. Children followed paths. Skills transferred. Modern mobility is promised, but not delivered equally. Many blue-collar workers remain trapped. Promise without delivery creates despair. Time ownership. Ancient workers did not own freedom, but they owned their evenings. Work ended. Modern workers technically own freedom, but work follows them. Over time, second jobs, side hustles. Time is fragmented. Ownership becomes illusion. A direct comparison. Ancient worker. No job choice. Guaranteed food. Guaranteed shelter. Community life. Modern blue-collar worker. Job choice in theory. No guarantees. Market dependency. Social isolation. Which system is crueler? The answer depends on where you stand. Why this comparison makes people angry? Because it breaks a myth. The myth that history moves forward cleanly. It does not. It zigzags. We gain technology. We lost security. We gain choice. We lost stability. The real question: would you trade choice for security? Ancient Egypt answered yes. Modern society answers no. But millions live with the consequences. Transition to next part. Now comes the other side of the modern workforce. the group that believes itself most free. White-collar workers, office jobs, degrees, emails. In the next part, we compare ancient Egyptian laborers to modern white-collar workers, and that comparison will be even more uncomfortable. How many of the 8 billion people live better than ancient Egyptian slaves? This is an uncomfortable question, but it is a necessary one. To answer it, we must first define something clearly. What does living better actually mean? Is it freedom on paper or daily reality? Is it income or security? Is it choice or survival? Let's remove emotion and nostalgia. Let's compare conditions, not ideals. Ancient Egyptian slaves, especially those attached to the state or temples, had several guarantees. They had guaranteed food, not luxury food, but daily calories. They had guaranteed shelter, simple housing, but protection from nature. They had defined work cycles. Work followed the sun. Rest followed religious calendars. They had social belonging. They were part of a structure. They were not invisible. Now let's look at the modern world. Out of roughly 8 billion people alive today, how many lack at least one of these guarantees? According to global development data, over 700 million people live in extreme poverty. That means less than enough food to survive properly. Around 1.6 billion people live in inadequate housing. Slums, temporary shelters, unsafe environments. Over 3 billion people lack stable employment or social protection. No contracts, no health insurance, no safety net. Hundreds of millions work longer hours than ancient laborers ever did, with fewer rest days, with no religious or cultural protection. Now add another layer. Mental health. Ancient Egyptian slaves did not wake up questioning their worth. They did not compare themselves to millions of others online. They did not carry debt that followed them for decades. They had no illusion of freedom, but also no illusion of infinite choice. Modern humans live surrounded by opportunity they cannot reach. This produces anxiety, depression, and burnout on a massive scale. Now let's talk about white-collar workers. They are not starving. They are not homeless. But many are trapped. They sell time instead of labor. They work indoors under artificial light. They sit for 10 hours a day. Their survival depends on performance metrics, KPIs, quarterly reports. One mistake can erase years of stability. They have freedom, but only if they can afford it. And now blue-collar workers, construction workers, factory workers, delivery drivers, warehouse laborers. Many work longer hours than ancient slaves. Many face higher injury risks. Many lack long-term security. And unlike ancient systems, modern society often treats them as replaceable. If they break, they are discarded. Ancient Egypt did not easily discard workers. A trained worker was valuable. A skilled laborer was protected. A body was an asset. Now comes the hard estimate. If we define living better as having reliable food, stable shelter, predictable work, community belonging, psychological security, then roughly 3 to 4 billion people alive today do not meet that standard. That means nearly half of humanity lives in conditions that are equal to, or worse than, many ancient Egyptian slaves. This does not mean ancient slavery was good. It means modern civilization has failed to deliver its promises. We abolish chains, but replace them with debt, precarity, isolation, Fear of falling. Ancient slaves knew their position. Modern humans live one paycheck away from collapse while being told they are free. And this leads to the final realization. Freedom without security is not freedom. Choice without stability is not power. And progress that benefits only a minority is not progress. It is rebranding. In the final part, we will ask the question no one likes to hear. Did humanity actually move forward, or just change the shape of control? When we look at history, we like to believe there is a straight line of progress. From slavery to freedom. From chains to rights. From survival to fulfillment. But history does not move in straight lines. It changes shapes. Ancient Egyptian slavery was visible. It was named. It was accepted. It was regulated. Modern systems are invisible. They are disguised as choice. They are explained as opportunity. They are justified as necessity. In ancient Egypt, a slave knew who controlled their labor. The state, the temple, the household. Today, control is fragmented. Employers, markets, debt, algorithms, social expectations. No single master, but no clear escape either. Ancient slaves did not compete with millions of others for survival. They did not fear becoming irrelevant overnight. They did not measure their worth through productivity dashboards. Their value was physical and visible. Modern humans are abstract assets. Data points, performance curves, engagement metrics. Ancient Egypt promised order, mad. Modern society promises freedom. But freedom without protection becomes anxiety. Ancient slaves had limits placed on their lives. Modern people have limits placed on their minds. You can leave your job if you can afford it. You can rest if you fall behind. You can speak if it doesn't cost you stability. This is not ancient slavery. But it is not full freedom either. It is something quieter, more polite, more efficient, more psychological. Ancient slaves worked to survive. Modern people work to avoid collapse. Ancient slaves were owned. Modern people are indebted. Ancient slaves were fed because they were needed. Modern workers are replaceable because there is always someone cheaper. And yet, here is the most important difference. Ancient Egyptian slaves did not believe the system was fair. Modern humans are told it is. They are told, if you fail, it is your fault. If you struggle, you didn't try hard enough. If you burn out, you weren't strong enough. This internalizes control. The most powerful system is not the one that forces obedience. It is the one that convinces people they chose it. So did humanity move forward? Yes, in rights. Yes, in technology. Yes, in potential. But not in security. Not in dignity for all. Not in shared prosperity. We replaced whips with deadlines, chains with contracts, masters with markets. The form changed. The pressure remained. And the final truth is this. A society should not be judged by how free its best lives are, but by how protected its weakest lives are. Ancient Egypt protected its workers to preserve order. Modern civilization sacrifices millions in the name of growth. Progress is real, but it is incomplete. And until freedom includes stability, until dignity is not conditional, until survival is not a competition, we are not as far from the ancient world as we like to believe. We are simply wearing better clothes.